I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is How to Train a Happy Mind. Today, my guest is Tenzin Chogkyi, one of our most popular guests, and she's back to talk about another one of the 6 perfections that we've been talking with other guests about this year. This one is enthusiasm, or joyful effort. She talks about not just the Buddhist ideas of enthusiasm, but how to maintain our joy and enthusiasm in life when things are difficult, or even when we get too much of a good thing. You know, so many people I talk to, wonderful people who have dream jobs, complain that there's too much of a good thing. They're too busy and they're stressed out. So this episode talks a little bit about that, and also the highest ideal of joyful effort, to find enthusiasm in virtue, in doing good in the world. There's some excellent points that come out of this episode as to what virtue is, how to cultivate it, how to stay enthusiastic, and especially when to take a break, which turns out to be one of the most important points. If you've been listening for a while, you may want to consider joining our Train a Happy Mind community, which you can join for free or by donation at trainahappymind.org. And there's also a book based on the podcast called How to Train a Happy Mind. In fact, the Indian version of the book comes out this week, Indian English version. Here's Tenzin Chogkyi. Tenzin Chogkyi, it's a pleasure to have you back on How to Train a Happy Mind. Some of our most popular episodes have been the ones that featured you. And also, you're now helping to lead meditations in our Train a Happy Mind community, which we also receive rave reports when you lead them. So thanks for being a part of our community.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's always such a pleasure to chat with you about all the important things.
We've loosely been following a thread in many of the episodes this year of the 6 perfections, which are these practices of bodhisattvas, people who want to live their lives to benefit others. And we've gone through a number of them so far, including ethics with Dr. Larry Ward recently, talking really deeply about race and cause and effect karma. Today we're on the topic of joyful effort. To start out, can you just tell me a little bit what it is? What is joyful effort?
Yeah. And that's such a good question. And I laugh because I remember one time the translator, Alan Wallace, saying, "Oh, for crying out loud, please don't call it effort," right? Because we have enough of that striving, pushing mind. And so he translates it, and I think Stephen Batchelor also, as enthusiasm, which is a little bit more light than this idea of joyful effort, which almost sounds like an oxymoron, right? And so it's defined as taking joy in virtue, right? So instead of taking joy in, just distraction or even, some sort of wrong deeds, it's actually having our happiness come from our practices of virtue, whether that be meditation practice, serving others in all the ways that we do it, all of our virtuous activities, which to me is so inspiring. And one of the teachings I got about enthusiasm is it's the 4th of the 6 perfections, or perfectings. One of my teachers said it can be glossed as either perfection and that which perfects us. So the perfectings, kind of more of a gerund sort of framing of these things. And one of my teachers was explaining how the first 3, so the giving, the ethics, and the patience, create the causes for the Buddha's enlightened body, and then the concentration and wisdom, the last 2, create the causes for the Buddha's enlightened mind. And then enthusiasm informs both the practices that create the body and the practices that create the mind. So they kind of suffuse all of our practices, like taking joy in doing those practices, because otherwise it's not sustainable. And I think a lot of us are sort of survivors of, I think it's like a leftover of the kind of this Protestant work ethic idea that our spiritual practice or religious practice needs to be kind of pushing, striving, joyless. We're sort of suspicious of joy. So I love this Buddhist idea that everything is just suffused by this enthusiasm and this joy and this delight in our practice, because it really is the thing that makes these practices sustainable.
Yeah, that's a good translation. To prepare for this episode, last night I was reading Shanti Deva's chapter on the topic. And yeah, I noticed that Stephen Batchelor translated it as enthusiasm. This thing you say about verbs versus nouns or gerunds versus nouns. My understanding is that in Sanskrit, they don't even have the nouns, that every noun is actually the verb, that you are enthusing.
That's
There
right.
isn't really a way to say even enthusiasm. I think that is probably true to the Sanskrit origins of the Mahayana practices. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like that which gets us to that state, because if we think of perfection, sometimes we can already feel discouraged and feel like, oh gosh, I'm so far from that. But if we think about these are the practices that actually perfect our abilities to benefit others, then we're like, hey, I can do that. It's not
Yeah.
so discouraging. Yeah.
Can you remember when you first encountered this idea of enthusiasm, joyful
Well,
effort?
I think it probably was when I first started doing these 10-day Lam Rim classes. So I started out in Tibetan Buddhism. I was kind of experimenting with different Buddhist traditions. And then in 1991, went to Dharamsala and spent a long time at Tushita Retreat Center and did one 10-day course after another. But I think it was only later when I realized I sort of was grappling with my conditioning that spiritual practice was about striving and pushing and really looking at my deep kind of wish to transform because I didn't like myself very much, I think, and just how I was pushing against who I was and just exhausting myself. And it was a really good friend at one point who said, honey, like your best friend tells you the thing you don't want to hear that's really hard to hear. And she was like, your practice just doesn't seem very joyful. Like, where's the joy in practice? And that was a little bit, a couple of years into practice that I realized I had kind of let this idea taint what could be joyful and taking joy in the Dharma. And I really started exploring this idea and studying Master Shantideva more in depth and really got a lot of great pointers from that enthusiasm chapter in Master Shantideva about how to get that balance right. Because again, I realized I was burning myself out, not so much by the practices, but about my attitude of, oh, I need to push even harder and stronger, and almost being suspicious of joy. Like when I felt joyful, oh, I must not be pushing enough. And I realized how much my sort of the Protestant culture of North America had really kind of tainted what could be a joyful Buddhist practice. So that was, yeah, like I say, when you asked me to talk about one of the perfections, that's why I was enthusiastic about this one because I've really grappled with it and it's helped me a lot to kind of try and get that balance more with my practice.
Can you think of a time in your life where this enthusiasm helped you get through something difficult?
Well, I think changing my relationship to where joy comes from. I teach a course called Cultivating Emotional Balance, right? And so that's based on the work by several psychologists, including Paul Ekman, and in the whole field of positive psychology. One of the framings that we talk about in this class that I found helpful is the difference between kind of two flavors of happiness. One is called hedonia, and we're all kind of used to that word hedonic or hedonism, which isn't a bad thing, but it just means the happiness that comes from enjoying sensory pleasures, nice things to eat, nice places to go for a walk, and so forth. And then Aristotle coined this word eudaimonia, which is sometimes translated as genuine well-being. And that's the flavor of happiness that comes from making your life meaningful, really living in accordance with your core values, connection with others, serving others. So it's kind of a deeper, sense of well-being. And both are necessary for a happy life. But I think it was changing my framing from the framing of hedonia, which of course capitalism is highly invested in selling us the idea that we need happiness and it comes from things that we can possess and things that, we can be sold, to this idea of really checking in my own life, oh, happiness really comes from, my practice and serving others and developing these qualities of the six perfections is actually the way to a deeper, more fulfilling kind of happiness. So it's really about kind of over time changing my framing and overcoming the framing of the worldly idea that happiness comes from gain and fame and possessions and all of that. And just really checking with my own experience. And often when I'm teaching students, I have them check and I say, when you feel the happiest, take a little notebook with you and write down what just happened. And so many people say it comes from feeling like they're really present in the present moment. And there's a lot of research about how satisfying just that mindfulness of being aware of the present moment can be, and also benefiting others. And those are the two things that come up so much. So just kind of understanding more deeply the happiness that does come from having a virtuous mind, I think was the big turnaround for me.
Earlier, you described this effort as finding joy in virtue. And I find the word virtue is one people get hung up on quite quick. Both the words ethics and virtue, first of all, I find people I had a conversation this weekend with a woman who brought it up independently about ethics. And then almost apologetically, she's like, but I understand that's relative. It means different things to people. And I said, does it? Does it really? I think maybe there are some universally good things actually that we can call out. So when people say, what is virtue? You just described it really nicely. Two forms of virtue that are probably simpler than many people think. One is being present, just being totally present for yourself or for someone else. And the other is benefiting others.
I do a lot of interfaith work. I've been volunteering for about 10 years for an organization based in the South Bay called the Islamic Networks Group that has these interfaith panels, for education about different religions. And actually, I have been on several panels in just the last couple of weeks. And one of the topics for the panels that we do a lot is called shared values among faiths. And so much of the values that we talk about, and it's so inspiring to compare in the faith traditions, because like you say, there is some universality to what all the main religions consider ethics, even though there's a great difference perhaps in a worldview and what the ultimate goal of the spiritual path is. And His Holiness says this too, in terms of ethics, so much commonality, loving kindness, compassion, giving, generosity, always come up as a through line in all the faith traditions. In fact, I had one really moving experience. We were asked to give a panel for the Parliament of World Religions a couple of years ago when it was fully online. And one of the prompts for all five of us of the five major traditions was, what's one value in your faith tradition that inspires you the most? We all chose compassion, and we hadn't decided on it ahead of time, but we all talked about compassion independently. And it was just this wonderful unifying moment. So like you say, Scott, I don't know that it's true that ethics are that relative. I think is some sort of universality to what all the, at least faith traditions and maybe the secular humanism and everything else would call ethics. And in Buddhism, the basis is non-harming. The Buddha talked about the bliss of blamelessness, and I know what it's like when you sit down to meditate and you have so many regrets about the snarky things you said about someone behind their back, and it leads to an unpeaceful mind, which is an unhappy mind. And so there's something about behaving ethically that leads to a happy mind, because your mind is not filled with remorse and regret, which is so disturbing to the mind. So I think it all interconnects, really, very much so.
I think what you say is very important because these perfections, they come in an order. They're called perfections, right? And they come in an order, and ethics does come before the enthusiasm. And what you just pointed out, I think, is why, because it is very, very difficult to be present and happy if you are doing things that harm yourself or harm others, even small ones. We're quite lucky in this Tibetan Buddhist tradition because we have these ways to constantly forgive ourselves and what we call purification. But even little things, I find just a little bit speaking rudely to my wife or something, it does kind of weigh, and you need a way to process it and let go. How do we do that? Like joyful effort isn't something you just turn on. Can you talk more about the on ramp into it? Like how do we get there?
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think it's kind of like the first is really noticing that level of happiness, that eudaimonia, like really noticing how virtue makes us happy, because we kind of think that virtue is just going to be a drag and sort of drudgery and this sort of joyless striving. But really noticing, wow, that moment of happiness that I felt when I listened to that friend who was having a hard time and gave them empathy, and they thanked me for understanding. Like just that warm glow, like that feeling that we feel. And just starting to notice it and sort of validating that. Like I say, it goes against kind of the mainstream ideas about where happiness comes from, which is consumerism and all the things. But just noticing for ourselves. And I find for a lot of people who enter a spiritual path, at a certain point, they kind of simplify because they realize they're kind of prioritizing more of that inner happiness rather than the happiness that comes from just being busy all the time or doing all the things or getting the latest devices. And often they just notice this natural simplification because of kind of attending to where our happiness really comes from. And then I think the joy is the litmus test. And that's what I love about Master Shantideva's chapter on enthusiasm, because he gives us a really easy 4-step process for maintaining that joyful effort. It's called the 4 powers. And the first one is aspiration, like we have to want to engage in, virtue, and that's a problematic word. But if we think of it just in terms of those beneficial states of mind and actions that are motivated by those beneficial states of mind, we say, oh, I want that. And then the steadfastness, which says we don't give up right away. We just persist in our efforts to benefit beings and so forth. And then joy is the real litmus test. Like we have to take joy in those practices. And if we're losing our joy, then we rest. The last power is rest or relinquishment. And it doesn't mean giving up, but it means taking a break if we've lost our joy. And I think that, for me, is how I've been able to keep going for decades. You ask, like, how does joy help me? I think it's like when I lose my joy and I'm doing the things because I feel like I should, and then I start to have this mind of resentment. Oh, I have to go, help this person or have to go do this thing. I'm like, girl, just take a break. This is when Master Shantideva said, do something to rest and get your joy back. We're doing it in a joyless way. Hey, it's not really helpful to others at all. And we're going to burn out. I mean, that's where that burnout comes from, is losing our joy. So not feeling bad about taking a break when we need to, and using joy as the litmus test. I remember one example I often give is, I was living in a retreat center and I was much younger, so I could teach these 10-day retreats nearly back to back, one after another. Like there's no way I can consider that now, but I remember I'd had this kind of intense teaching period. This is maybe 15 years ago or so, with a bunch of 10-day retreats over and over. And the day after the last retreat finished, I was exhausted. And it was wintertime, and it was when the Harry Potter books were coming out, and somebody had just given me the latest Harry Potter. And I stayed in my pajamas in bed and read Harry Potter and drank tea all day. And I was like, that was fine. I really needed to do that. And then the next day I was fine to get back into things. But I really realized in that moment I was exhausted. And that's what I needed to do, is just give my mind a break and my body a break and just rest. And if I kept pushing and said, no, my life is short, my precious human rebirth, like I have to keep pushing. And that's why I think sometimes in our Buddhist communities, we create a culture of pushing, which doesn't really support people in their joy. And I see this. I had a friend who recently was talking about, he had an offer to move to a Buddhist center, but he said, but the culture there is nobody ever takes a break. And the culture is, oh, you're benefiting beings, you have to do it 24/7. And he said, I'm older and I just can't do that now. And I said, I think you should go there and disrupt that culture because it's not really sustainable. Like we all want to be as beneficial as possible. But often you can get into a culture if anybody takes a day off or anybody takes a break, it's really looked down on rather than supporting these four powers that Master Shantideva talks about, including the power of rest. And I think we need to kind of change our culture, those of us that are involved in Buddhist community, and really support people in what's going to keep them balanced. That's what it's about. Because otherwise you see people burn out or they go, I'm never going to volunteer in another Buddhist center ever again. They just ask too much and judge me if I ever take time off, So I think it's a cultural shift that should happen also.
This might be actually the most important lesson for anybody listening to take away, because it seems to travel across even, people who have been monks and nuns for 30, 40 years. Like it affects everybody. Well, I wanted to mention two things. One is when I was working a long time ago in a company in Silicon Valley, and I would have a coffee, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes late morning. And then I guess I was just starting to become a Buddhist, and I started to just watch my mind, like, when do I go to get a coffee? I was thinking, what's in my mind when I go to get a coffee? And I realized it was because I was trying to get myself to do something I didn't want to do.
Wow.
So then I decided,
Right.
I think I'll give up coffee, and I'll either not do the things I don't want to do, ideally, or take a break. So I started just like taking a nap out in the sun, and it was like, and Venerable Rene, he says this. He says if you do a 1 week retreat, you need to take a 1 week vacation also to go along with it. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just I interview so many incredible people, and a lot of them, I asked in some ways a kind of naive question that I almost always get the same answer, because I say, oh, it must be so wonderful to be a scientist studying contemplation or whatever. And I almost always get the same answer, which is, it would be if I didn't have so much of it. It's the answer I get from I know so many people who have their dream job, whether it's in a corporation or an artist, a musician, in business, even in Buddhism. Actually, a number of the really successful Buddhist teachers, who I won't name their names, it's the same thing. They're like, oh my God, I'm so burnt out. So this may be the most important lesson. Like, this is in the scriptures, in the ancient scriptures, about how to be enthusiastic and get a lot of good things done, is to take a break and relax. Rest, right?
And one of the things that might motivate people too is to realize, how do you come across to somebody coming to the center, right? If you're so stressed and so maxed out, you don't even have time to greet anyone, or they see you running around snapping at people, they're going to be like, oh, if this is what Buddhism does, forget it. I had an experience recently, so I went up to visit a friend who's starting a monastic community outside of Portland, and we had one day that we were visiting another friend of mine who lives up there. And she told us about this Buddhist Druid retreat center. And you heard that right. The Buddhist and a Druid decided to go in together on some land. So my friend and I are like, let's go visit since we're in the area. We went to visit, and the monk who was the main teacher and who'd founded the place, in his 80s, he'd been ordained for 61 years in the Vietnamese Zen tradition, gave us a 3-hour tour. And whenever we stopped, and there was a visitor there that he hadn't met yet, he'd stop and in this warm, friendly way say, hi, what did you hear about us? We stood in the middle of the gravel parking lot with 3 visitors and did a 5-minute meditation practice. And I guarantee you, every single visitor to that place, including us, felt like whatever he's doing, I want that, because he was spacious, he was warm, he had time. And I know he had 8 million things to do. He was basically running this big place single-handedly. But he had such a vibe of spaciousness and welcome and warmth. And it really struck me because, again, what kind of an example are we setting for people interested in Buddhism just by the energy we bring to an interaction? And if we're so busy and so maxed out that we can't even stop and greet somebody in a friendly way, And unfortunately, I think that's often the case.
Mm.
But yeah, so looking at that, looking at the impact, if we really want to benefit beings, one of the hugest ways we can benefit is just by example and by people seeing us and wanting to emulate whatever it is that they see us manifesting. And if it's stress and overwhelm, then not very inspiring. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think if each of us thinks about the people we most enjoy being with or having met, they're like that. Like I'll tell you, and they're not all Buddhists too, obviously.
No, totally.
Like
Yeah.
I'll tell you, one of the best ones I know is actually my realtor. I've worked with the same realtor since 1996, in different times in our life when we moved. And he's just an extraordinary person who, as soon as she comes in, it's like she has unlimited time for you. And it doesn't
Yeah.
even seem like she wants to help you sell or buy the house, but she's just really interested in you. I mean, and it's
Yeah.
often, it's my wife would sometimes complain because it's like sometimes like a 3 hour meeting and we're like 2.5 is like just hanging out. But it's very nice. And the crazy thing is she's literally the most successful realtor in California. Like she sold like more houses by she's like the Serena Williams of California real estate. Like she literally is the very best realtor, sells the most houses.
Wow. Yeah.
And when you're with her, it's like she's not answering her phone, she's not text message anything. Now I will tell you, it can be very hard to get a hold of her sometimes because you're trying to call her and she's having a 3 hour hangout with somebody else.
Yeah.
But it
But
all
you're
works.
also
It all
like
works.
loyal to people like that. Like when
Yeah.
you said that, I was just thinking about my doctor who, they're only meant to see you for 15 minutes. Mine comes in, has this huge check in just about how I'm doing as a human. And I'm like, who cares about her medical advice, which is also brilliant, but that's not, but I'll never leave her because she is like relates to me as a human and has this spacious attitude of making me feel that being with me is the most important thing in that moment. So I think it's that too. It's not surprising this person is so successful because she, like you, she has these loyal people. You've been with her since 1997. That says a lot, right? Who is it? Maya Angelou or somebody like that said, it's not what you tell people, it's how you make them feel. Right. And so I think a lot of our impact on people isn't, I think that as a Buddhist teacher, if somebody doesn't remember the details of the three of this and the 10 of that, but they remember how they feel. So I'm trying to kind of create that presence of warmth and spaciousness because then it makes them feel better and validated, not so much about the detail of what they get from my
Mm.
teaching. Yeah.
I had this conversation with my family last night because my daughter was asking, she said, why does the United States keep falling in the happiness scale?
Oh,
Because she reads
y-
like this kids magazine, The Week Junior, and
yeah.
every year she says she sees America falling.
Falling.
And my wife and I tried to share our theories, and one of them I said is because we have so much wealth, we're like the wealthiest country, but we're also the busiest. Like we
Yeah.
don't take that wealth to relax and to work, 10-hour weeks. We just
Yeah.
consume
Yeah.
more and work more, and
And
we
don't
need
take
to
care of each
relax
other. Don't use
and don't
that
take.
wealth. I have a
Yeah.
friend from Brazil, and I remember the first time he came, he was coming every year to study with his Zen master. And the first year he came, I'm kind of touring him around, and he's seeing all the unhoused people on the street. And I felt like every sentence during his first tour was like, can you please explain? Because I don't understand. So he's seeing these people and he's like, wait, I don't understand. Like the richest country, how are there all these people, 2 blocks away from the McMansions with the security fences and all of that. And he just, for him, coming from Brazil, he just, where there are a lot of poor people but there isn't those disparities the way
No.
there is here, and he just didn't understand at all how both things can be possible within a 5 block radius of each other. Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. In any
Yeah.
city, my art studio, I still spend about 25% of my time making art. And my art studio is in a part of town that there's a ton of hundreds of
Yeah.
homeless people and or unhoused people, as you'd
Yeah.
say. And there's also right across from our studio is a sports car restoration company. So there's literally like $100 million of like 10 cars, and it's worth like $100 million total right there. So I saw this guy every day. It's this contrast. So I saw this guy picking up his car, backing up his Ferrari into the street. And then this homeless guy who lives right across the street comes over and he says, hey, I want to tell you something. And the guy in his car, he doesn't like rush away in his Ferrari. He actually looks up. He's like, yeah, what?
What?
And the homeless, unhoused person, he says, you're a lucky man. And the guy was like, thanks, and then he drove away. I thought at least he might have given him $20 or something. But
Yeah, yeah, the disparities. And I think
oh God.
I read a book years and years ago called The Spirit Level, and it was just all about how the countries that did the worst on all of these, you know, data points like child mortality and rates of incarceration and rates of drug addiction were the ones that had the most income inequality. And that was like the biggest predictor for across the board, teen pregnancy, all of these things, like 15 different things. And then they showed chart after chart after chart that correlated exactly income inequality with all of these other demographic markers of unhappiness, basically. So to answer her question, to answer Samaya's question, it's the inequality that gives rise to it.
Yeah, there was a great article in the New York Times about Finland, this woman who went to Finland in the winter to try to understand why is Finland the happiest country. When she went in the winter when it's dark 24 hours a day. And what she found was kind of what you said, like there aren't the extremes, like, the people who don't have homes they're hanging out in the library and sleeping there, but not it's more like comfortable and even, and people aren't as uncomfortable with it, and people basically just had simple, happy lives. The library was beautiful, and people would do like dancing and exercise and just enjoy each other's company. They had just kind of simpler expectations for what makes you happy, which is actually the actual things that make you happy are just being present with other people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And lowering the expectations of material riches
Yeah.
making us happy, because so much data shows that that's not true at all. I mean, after a certain point, like after your basic needs have been met, study after study shows, yes, up to about $50,000 of income for the average American, there is a correlation between happiness and income, and then it just completely disappears. Like we don't need that excess. What we really are lacking is connection and making our life meaningful. And those are the two main things that keep coming out in study after study is the real causes of happiness. Yeah, yeah.
It's two simple takeaways, though. It's just give people your attention, including yourself.
Yeah.
Take a break. I guess it's three things. Take a break, give people your attention, including yourself, and do kind things for others, however small.
Yeah.
Right? These go a long way toward genuine enthusiasm.
And I find like a variety of things that serve others and experiment with what works for you. Because a lot of times I'll have students come and they'll say, oh, what's the best thing to do to benefit? Is it people experiencing homelessness, people experiencing incarceration? Is it hospice? Is it children's? And I go, figure out what really, you have a passion for, and then do that thing. Because it needs to match what your interests are and what your talents are. And then it'll be sustainable, and then it'll give you joy. Don't feel like you should do the thing because that's the most need to do that thing. There was a civil rights activist and minister called Howard Thurman, and he said, don't ask what the world needs, ask what you need to come alive, because what the world needs is people who've come alive. So I think that's a recipe for joy too, is getting over thinking that there's a one-size-fits-all version or the most important thing to do. I learned a phrase from somebody recently on an interfaith panel, and she kept talking about one size fits one. So there's the one size that fits us for what makes us come alive. And so pick attention to our joy, like using that as the litmus test for what we should be engaged in and experimenting around until we find the one thing or the many things. One of the things that I've experimented with recently is, in addition to teaching, which I hope benefits beings, that's certainly my aspiration, and I say the things, but it's kind of hard to see the benefit in the short term. So I've started also volunteering at this food pantry because there's something so satisfying about putting the potatoes and onions and cabbage in a bag that's somebody's going to be able to use that night to make dinner for their family. And so it's like the short-term benefit and the long-term benefits. And for me, kind of mixing it up and just paying attention, because I just went yesterday for 3 hours and we were really short-staffed and I was exhausted after my 3-hour shift of putting the potatoes in the bag. But it felt great too. Like I kind of limp out of there and it's like, oh, I really need lunch now. But it felt so good in that eudaimonic way of like, oh, genuinely, I did something that feels, benefiting people, even in the short term. Because I think sometimes as Buddhist students, we overlook short-term benefit for the long term. We think, oh, it's only about getting people enlightened. That's the only benefit. And then we overlook all the ways that we can make people, help people suffer less in the short term while we're working for their ultimate enlightenment. And so I think that's something I'd noticed too, is not to overlook those other ways because they also give us a boost and make us feel like we're really benefiting in the moment as much as our aspirations are for the long-term benefit as well.
Yeah, sometimes I think maybe I'm missing something. In our strain, you're not even thinking about this life. You're like, okay, well, I need to get enlightened in a few more lifetimes and then I'll be able to help people. And I'm not down with that. I just can't get on board. Like there's so many, there's 7 billion people and they're right outside the door. When I was younger, I remember like on a weekend, you work really hard and then you're on the weekend, and then sometimes there's this kind of despondency, I feel just like, oh gosh, what am I doing? What's the point? And what I started to do with something like you is when I really kind of feel down like that, I would go and I would buy a chicken. I'd buy a roast chicken and I'd go find somebody without a home on the street and just give it to them. I was vegetarian too, but it seemed like the right thing to give. Like, oh, this is nutritious and healthy, like a roast chicken. I think people would like that. And I would feel better. I would, after, it would take like an hour to do that. And then I'd be like, oh, okay, at least I did like one nice thing, helped someone eat a healthy meal who couldn't afford it.
Yeah, I think we need to do all the levels. And I think it's also a misunderstanding I know that I had when I first started studying Buddhism. There's kind of a mistranslation often of the First Noble Truth. The Buddha said life is suffering. So it makes us suspect of any momentary happiness we have and we think, oh, it felt good, but I guess it must not have been. And what the Buddha really said was, as long as we're subject to karma and delusions, there's the potential for suffering, but it doesn't mean to second guess those moments of connection that we have, those moments of feeling good when we serve others, laughing with a friend, connecting with someone, enjoying nature. And I think sometimes we go overboard and we won't even allow ourselves those small pleasures because we think, well, not only is it a waste of time, but it isn't really happiness because the Buddha said life is suffering. I think overcoming that wrong view, which helps us relax, like it's rest to us means hanging out with friends and just laughing and connecting, or rest for us looks like taking a walk in nature. And then if we're suspicious of those activities because we think they're really in the nature of suffering because there's nothing in life that's happiness at all, oh my gosh, then we're just going to tie ourselves up and not be able to get any balance at all. Yes, the Buddha said walking in nature is not the cause of ultimate lasting happiness, only liberation from samsara. Okay, but it doesn't mean in that moment it doesn't feel good, or paying attention, or I love going in Santa Cruz. There's this beautiful arboretum, and I love taking a break and just going for a walk in the arboretum and looking at all of the beautiful blooming flowers and just kind of being offline for an hour and enjoying nature. And, there's nothing about that that's not temporary, fleeting happiness, and it's good enough.
One of my favorite quotes from this chapter, the Shantideva chapter on enthusiasm, is that For a person practicing enthusiasm proceeds in life from joy to joy.
Isn't that beautiful?
I think about that all the time, and it's a very good, archetype and model for your life. Like that's how it should feel if you're
Yeah.
doing these practices, right?
Yeah. And I love there's one verse where he says, when we're engaging in virtue, we should do it with the same enthusiasm as an elephant on a really hot day plunging into a cold pool.
Yeah.
You imagine you're just as into it, like, oh, I get to go to the food bank and pack potatoes in bags. Yes, just like an elephant plunging into a cold pool. I love that. But it really takes that balance. And if we're coming from that striving, pushing kind of attitude, or trying to make ourselves into someone different, and so that's where, to get back to the last topic we talked about of self-compassion, like just having some self-kindness and self-compassion is what we need for balancing our practice and making it sustainable. Because if we're always trying to push to make ourselves somebody different than who we are because we don't like ourselves very much, like that's what's behind a lot of it too. I think a lot of that really striving, pushing practice. I know it was in my case. I feel like I'm a survivor of all the things that I'm warning against. And in
Mhm.
the first, decade at least of my Dharma practice, I had to learn the hard way. And luckily, I was able to bring some mindfulness to these things and kind of reframe, because I think I was really subject to all of the things that I'm talking about.
I want to ask you, do things still get hard for you? Do you have moments when it's still hard to practice, to stay enthusiastic, to stay optimistic? Is it hard for you? And if it is, like, what do you do to bring back that enthusiasm?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And the answer is definitely yes. I think what I've learned over the decades is just some habits of course correction that come in a little bit sooner. Like when I feel like I sort of lose my way, in the beginning, I didn't really know what to do. And now at least I've got like the go-to kind of course corrections. Like if I'm feeling discouraged, I know more quickly, oh, I need connection, deep connection with people to have a conversation about meaningful things. And then I'm going to feel inspired. Or if I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed by the news, which happens a lot, and feeling despair, I think immediately I kind of know some things to do to get my hopefulness back and to reconnect with hope and joy. And so I think that's it. Not that, I go through 24/7 joyful and inspired all the time, but I think it's just like through trial and error. Like I figured out what to do to course correct, so it comes to
Mhm.
mind a little bit more quickly when I'm aware that I feel really out of balance, and also like I say, acknowledging and affirming the need to go for a walk or connect with friends and do the things that may not feel so meaningful in the moment that they're benefiting all beings, but it's that connection and rest that I need to be able to kind of go back and teach a class. And also
Mm.
realizing what rest looks like is not necessarily just sleeping or lying around and reading a novel. It's something I'm doing to resource myself, which could mean going to a movie or taking a walk or something. So the rest, like broadening the idea of rest into more what a lot of people call resourcing, like what will resource my energy. And a lot of times that is going out and doing something that's different. So maybe instead of
Mm.
necessarily rest, which means like lying in bed and reading Harry Potter, sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes it is just taking a break for connection or taking a break for nature, or taking a break for entertainment and doing something. So kind of broadening that too. And realizing how resourcing connection is for me. Because sometimes I think, oh, I can't have one more conversation. But then if I have a meaningful conversation with a good friend, wow, what a boost that is,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes I'm like, oh, I just can't do one more thing. But then realizing, half an hour of connection with someone that loves me and really sees me and gives me empathy and we're talking about something meaningful. Wow, incredible. What a boost that is. So not shortchanging even those moments in terms of resourcing to kind of keep going.
You're reminding me why I keep doing this podcast, because the things you mentioned also really recharge me, especially a deep, meaningful conversation. It's surprisingly difficult to have such conversations in our culture today because we're busy, because conversations tend to be shallow and interrupted. That's what this conversation like we're having right now, at least does for me, is that kind of because the effort is very high running this podcast. It's time consuming. It's a lot of work. It's
Totally.
expensive. It's
Yes.
expensive too. But this is what makes it worthwhile, is that it's restorative, it's connecting. And then it echoes, it seems to echo out for the people who listen to have a similar benefit.
Yeah. And finding that, and sometimes we need to create those kind of meaningful connections. Like, I was looking forward to this morning because right after we talk, I'm actually meeting with a couple of people that I've been working with off and on for a couple of years who run a local organization that deals with the issue of homelessness in Santa Cruz, which is such a big issue. And we did an event in March that we followed with what we called a 30-day compassion challenge. I kind of designed this 30-day compassion challenge to follow this big event because I said, people come to an event and they hear a bunch of speakers and they're really inspired, but it would be so great to have them carry the idea of compassion through. So we did a compassion challenge. And then we decided the people that organize the event, we want to meet every month. So we're starting a monthly meeting we're calling Compassion and Chai to just keep the conversation going about what can we do in our community to uplift the virtue of compassion. And it's that kind of thing that seemed the most energizing to me and the most meaningful, is to get together with like-minded people to talk about how you can continue this work. So for people listening to this, think about ways that you can do that. If you feel like, oh, my conversations are kind of shallow and not more so meaningful, and we talk about like what was on TV last night or what the news or whatever, sometimes you need to engineer ways to make those connections deeper, and especially kind of focused on shared core values, because that is the thing that's the most energizing and really keeps us balanced in our work of benefiting others and enacting virtue. And yeah, virtue, to circle back to what you said before, Scott, virtue and ethics, they kind of have this taint of fundamentalism. And I think we need to reclaim those words, because if we think about ethics being based on non-harming, I was actually thinking about this today before talking to you too. When I was thinking about, I think it was back in the 80s, there was a movement called the Moral Majority, and it was this fundamentalist movement against gay marriage and, all of these things. And then there was another group called the Immoral Minority that most of my friends were part of. But I think we need to reclaim the idea of ethics, that it doesn't mean oppression and fundamentalism, that it really is about the ethics of non-harming and compassion and love and care for all beings. And, it doesn't have to have this taint of oppression that it has sometimes gotten in our culture, I think.
Yeah, I really think so. There's something where people do sort of enjoy being naughty, partying in our culture. Have you watched The White Lotus at all?
No, I'd heard about
show?
it, but I haven't.
The guy who runs the show is a Tibetan Buddhist, and it's almost the most Buddhist show I've ever seen, because it really captures what we call like the suffering of change. Like when people are, in particular, partying. I've never quite seen in a television show or movie so clearly showing people trying so hard to have a good time, like drugs and sex and everything, and really not having, like, capturing that, the way that even as you think you're doing this thing that's supposed to be enjoying, you're absolutely miserable through the whole thing. So yeah, to find joy in nonviolence, caring for others, kindness.
Something you said earlier too made me think of, often there'll be this question when I do the compassion training: how can we have compassion for people who do harmful things or unethical things? And to me, it's so easy because they really think it's the cause of happiness, and they're so confused about why it's not. And just that despair and confusion that comes from, wait, this is what everyone told me is the cause of happiness and it doesn't work. Even when they're harming others, well, not to condone the harm, but how awful would that be to not have any idea about the true causes of happiness, which is care and kindness and caring for others and so forth, not partying and, just harming others and becoming rich and all of this. So I think it's like, to me, that's almost the tugs at my heartstrings the most, is people who think they're doing all the right things that should give them happiness and it's not working at all. The unhoused person, at least they know why they're not happy. But like the rich person who's sitting there in their mansion, miserable, right? They have no idea why not, because they thought they've done everything according to the American dream. So why isn't it working? So that to me is very sad.
Very sad.
Yeah.
Well, you've agreed to lead a meditation on this topic. We'll air it in the episode following this one, but do you want to say anything about what that is before we say goodbye?
Yeah, so there's a beautiful meditation that I learned from an insight teacher called Spring Washam, and she led a meditation on joy at one point. And so I'd like to lead that for the group. I'd also like to close out, if I could, with a quote that I love about joy. And this is from Maria Popova, who's a writer and interviewer. She does this weekly e-news called The Marginalia, which I often will kind of lift things from for different classes that I teach, because I find her to be a really subtle and beautiful teacher and thinker. And so there's one quote that I pulled out a while ago from one of her writings about joy. And she says, "Choose joy. Choose it like a child chooses the shoe to put on the right foot, the crayon to paint a sky. Choose it at first consciously, effortfully, pressing against the weight of a world heavy with reason for sorrow, restless with need for action. Feel the sorrow, take the action, but keep pressing the weight of joy against it all until it becomes mindless, automated, like gravity pulling the stream down its course, until it becomes an inner law of nature. Joy is not a function of a life free of fiction and frustration, but a function of focus, an inner elevation by the fulcrum of choice."
Beautiful way to end our conversation. Thank you. Well, may our conversation help people find very intelligent, wise ways of being enthusiastic and joyful in their lives. Thank you, Tenzin Chogkyi.
Thanks so much, Scott. I feel very joyful that we had this conversation.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for my interview with Tenzin Chogkyi about enthusiasm or joyful effort. If you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy our Train a Happy Mind community, where we have a course based on the entire sequence of analytical meditations that help develop these qualities. We have a Sunday meeting in which we get together on Zoom to talk about these topics and lead meditations, ask and answer questions. Or you can consider donating to the podcast too. It's actually quite expensive running this podcast, and it only stays afloat due to donations from me and from others. So you can find a link to that at howtotrainahappymind.org as well. We wish you a wonderful day. See you later for our next episode, a meditation on this topic of enthusiasm, joyful effort with Tenzin Chogkyi.